question. How do you see, because you said that he's also referring to conceptual artists in the 60s, how do you see, for example, this series of drawings of the empty gallery in relation to institutional critique?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that it's precisely, perhaps in relation to this idea of I mean, I think his work functions precisely parallel in that sense, almost a continuation of this idea of a parallelism, you know, within contemporary discourse, where, of course, it's a knowing, you know, he's very knowing about the art world. He knows exactly what institutional critique is, what its history is, and yet his work has a very different understanding, or can be understood quite differently, precisely because of its different origins, I would say. So it's this shift that takes place, and I suppose this is what I was trying to identify in this idea that somehow he takes an outsider position, rather than, if one thinks of a trajectory of institutional critique in the West, which is very much one of a knowing engagement with the practices of the museum, Ondák's work somehow always suggests that actually it's a form of critique that has emerged from outside, if that makes sense. I don't know if I explained this well enough. I mean, this idea of, again, sort of staging and theatricality, it's sort of a displacement, really, of the same notions, but with a different origin, that somehow, although, yes, formally or perhaps critically with a similar endpoint, its strategy is quite different. Somehow very much to do, back again to the sort of idea of the disappearance as well, and the way in which that has emerged from people like Julius Koller, whose work was, you know, partly operating in that way merely to avoid being part of a system. So it's a different reason for being institutionally critical, perhaps not even necessarily institutionally critical, just avoiding the institution, perhaps. And Ondák's work, without wanting to make it sound like a sort of soft institutional critique, because I don't think that's what it is at all. It's just a different means of making apparent similar ideas. Although I think at the same time, what it does do, this idea of the sort of staging in his work, and the sense of non-reality, which again I think obviously has very clear lineage from his own experience. Interesting parallel perhaps with an artist like Pavel Altama, who I think there are strong correlations between their work, where both of them suggest in multiple ways the idea of a reality as a film or a fiction, which I think again relates back to their own experience of growing up in a society where in fact reality was a fiction. You were told one thing, everything's fine, it's all great, but everybody knew that it wasn't fine and great. You know, this sort of idea that somehow you know, the image and the information don't match up. And that it's a sort of the same strategy that I think you see in his work.
Do you see any connection through criticism or the space he used to Marseille Broders, to talking about the space, the public spaces who belong to the public, and so on, getting out from the museum and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I'd sort of almost give the same answer, that yes, I think that there definitely is, that, you know, there's a knowledge and an understanding, but again, it's somehow slightly different, although I think perhaps closer to Brotes perhaps than, I mentioned Buren and Hans Hacker, but Brotes is perhaps closer in this sort of way in which the kind of the sort of notion of actually creating an alternative museum, or a fiction of a museum, is something that Roman Ondák plays with, although perhaps in a sort of updated version where it is more like the idea of a film, or a sort of script for a film. Perhaps one step removed, in that he's still working with rather than creating another museum, he's actually just fictionalizing the one that he works with, in a sense, or himself as well. That's what I also find so fascinating. I mean, he turns himself again, and I suppose it is.
But in a way, it's less criticizing the meaning of space.
I don't think so. I don't think so. No, I think it's perhaps you know, obviously it's at a point in time where it's harder to establish an alternative, perhaps, in the way that, I mean, the sort of relative capacity of his work to make a statement of alterity is radically reduced simply by the fact of what's happened in the last 30 years, perhaps. But I think it's absolutely similarly critical. I mean, the Tate Modern piece was an incredibly astute assessment of you know, a building that's basically all about this, you know, vacuous space in the middle of it that has become, you know, the center point for the whole museum. And then to choose, and maybe I didn't describe this that well, but the space in which he showed that model is precisely parallel to where the turbine hall is. It sort of almost sits, here's the big turbine hall, and there was the small turbine hall. But it was you know, absolutely, he looked at the place, he analysed it very quickly, and, you know, he had the idea immediately when we asked him to do the show. I mean, it was a very, you know, very, again, I suppose, again, this idea of somebody coming almost from the outside and looking at something and understanding it much better than those who are trying to articulate it inside. And of course he is inside. I mean, it's ridiculous to say that he's outside of the art world. He's not. But he manages to somehow take the perspective of somebody who is not.
But maybe it is from the perspective of a critic, and also what make his practice different from institutional critic in the West is that it can be thought in the context or origin where he came from, the Slovak context, where there is no strong or visible art institution.
Exactly.
So,
well, the institution was a different form of institution to analyse, which I think is also why his work is never, you know, I don't want to avoid, I want to avoid sounding critical here of a history of Brotas and so on, but I think it's where his work perhaps makes a very, fundamentally is always trying to stake a position that is making a parallel with a broader situation in society rather than an art world situation. So rather than the concerns of institutional critique, which are of course also paralleling society and yet work very minutely with the sort of adjustments of the activities of the institution, Ondák's work, I think, always tries to look at it more from this perspective of the institution as actually society as a whole. But
and how would this work, which is completely on the downstairs, where the box with money throws into the well? How
the wishing piece. It's much more.
How does this fit in? It's general.
I think it's a somewhat different piece, which I think he would probably say that too. It's certainly a little more lyrical. I mean, this idea of the wish, or the absurdly exaggerated wish, a lifetime of wishes stored up for this one moment. Although at the same time, it took place in a city which is known for its pilgrimages. So there's I suppose the location, the idea of these people. An endless stream of people going to the cathedral to basically make a wish for whatever it might be that they're hoping will improve in their life. And here you have this sort of slightly ludicrous, but also it's not a damning critique of the sort of process of projection that's going on in the cathedral, but it is obviously something of a spoof on that too.
Yeah.
But this man who perhaps, it's more narrative certainly than any of his
exactly.
other works. This idea that it's almost, I was thinking about it this morning, it's almost like the way in which he's asked the family and friends to produce a narrative of his own life. He's kind of producing a narrative of this person who perhaps lives in this town and has watched these people every day and thought, oh, what's, here's my, storing up the coins. But yes, more lyrical in a way.
it's not about money that is right?
Yeah, so again, sort of worthlessness and or not. Yeah.
But now in this lecture you quite focus on the issue of the space and how we read the site. But actually almost all the works is related to, quite explicitly related to time and waiting and duration and continuity. Like also title of the work and the title of this exhibition is The Day After Yesterday.
Yes.
And then the downstairs of this work is The Lucky Day. And then
But I think that's what interests me is this use of the site is in the work. That when he transfers the work, what I was saying, when you see a different piece in a different place, it precisely creates the site through that, but also the sense of time. Exactly. Yeah. Time and place fused, I suppose, is what I mean by site. But,
But how do you see this sense of time? Like, could you elaborate further?
Oh,
Also, that your show, this time zone, was quite focused on that how artists dealing with the time as a very abstract notion.
yeah. Oh, I think it's quite different with his work in that I think it's precisely back to this idea of staging. You know, and artificiality versus, you know, notions about the artificial versus the real, yesterday and today, the future. You know, the future is only today. You know, our understanding of the future is what we have today. Oh, it's actually also based on the future is in fact the past. I mean, in Futuropolis, the future is the past. If you see what I mean. I mean, I think it comes back to the same ideas of trying to identify layers of meaning through image, understanding, and received information. So past information, present image, and a sort of future projection of what that might be. If that makes sense.
Other questions?
Thank you.
Oh, I have
Okay.
another question. And I don't know how to formulate this question, but it's quite interesting. Also, at Tate Modern, there was this symposium called Rethinking Spectacle, and then he, like, in a way, confronted with this spectacle issue, and then his work.
Sorry, it'll stop now.
Yeah, I think his work almost authoritative way really emphasized smallness and little things. So, like, it can be a good mode of resisting the spectacle as a dominant cultural form of our society, or like, how do you see his gesture or his emphasis on smallness and little
On the disappearing.
Yeah, it also in comparison to the spectacle, and also you curated this
Spectacle.
project.
I agree with the spectacle. And of course, I have to admit that the work that he made for Tate Modern with me was probably the biggest thing that he's ever made, even though it was minute in comparison to the thing that it was based on. I think, I mean, it's sort of the aspect of disappearance, and Binna and I were talking about this in relation to the exhibition here, which maybe I'll say something about too, but I mean, I think it is one that comes so much from this lineage in the East of producing work that works outside of the sort of established avenues of art making. So even though he's working now within a very explicit art vein, it's still using the same tactic of producing meaning. I'm sort of not saying this in relation to spectacle, because I think maybe that's less the point. It is more to do with trying to come up with a strategy of functioning within the sort of context of whether it's institution or non-institution, by producing a work. Oh, sorry, I lost my point here. Much in the same way that, say, someone like Julius Koller was handing out cards in the street, his artwork was something that he sort of diffused through various means of events or things that he would photograph the events that he did, slightly absurdist actions. But it's sort of following the same logic of performing one's work on a scale that involves a public interaction. I'm not explaining this well at all, sorry. I think maybe I'm thrown off by the spectacle idea, because I think yes, I mean, they're sort of grand gestures in a very quiet presentation, but I think that the sort of, maybe what you're saying is, I mean, the concept is just as big as the concept of that may or may not be embedded in any kind of spectacular works. It's not about scale. His work seems actually precisely about this. I mean, that as you're saying, with the issues of time as well. I mean, it's precisely looking at these questions of scale in the terms of gesture. You know, the gesture of the coins, perhaps, is a very good example. You know? But they're, you know, because you had passed on this review to me that had come out here that was criticising the exhibition for being slight. but it was making me think about what happens when you group together his works in a solo exhibition, which we talked about a little bit. And I think it is slightly problematic for his work, which functions very well when it's an individual work within a context, a group context, and Ondák's work can act as a yes, as some sort of interference really within the total picture, or when it's a project like the one at Tate Modern, or perhaps his exhibition in Cologne, where it's one piece occupying, in a rather ambivalent sense, occupying the space as art, but it has this sort of question mark of whether it's art or what its purpose is. And it's much harder when you try to bring together a group of his works. This is very much true of Pavel Altum as well, I would say, and sort of have it perform in the same way, because it almost cancels itself out. It also becomes much more aestheticized. The sort of minimalism of the work becomes much more pronounced, and that's actually not the point. The sort of the minimal look of it is a strategy within the piece itself, but it's not about making a work that looks minimal. And I think that just becomes overly exaggerated when you see multiple works together sometimes.
Yeah, she's referring to the review on
Sorry.
NSA written by Jessica Yaneke. More questions? Then maybe shall we go upstairs and then have a drinks and then have more casual talk?
That's
And
very
then,
good.
yeah, the expression slightly mentioned that we are working on the publication, the monograph, which will be published in June, hopefully, but we will announce it. There will be 3 new essays by Jessica, and then Jan Verhoeven, the curator, critic based in Berlin, and also Maria Hilavaeva, director and then curator of Bach. So, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.